All right. Is the volume okay? Thanks everybody for coming. This paper is inspired by research on search and rescue HRI that I conducted at Stanford under the late Cliff Nass, and in some ways it can be considered a retrospective on that work. The broader applicability of the ideas presented here became clear after I began working and discussing validity issues with Wendy, whose projects often feature simulations. A little overview where we're headed. I'll begin by going over some definitions and the paper's claim, and then its contribution. Next, in the bulk of the presentation, I'll talk about the possibility of justifying our claim empirically and deliver our own theoretical justification for it. And finally, I'm going to close by reviewing measures, examples, and guidelines that are related to or follow from our argument. So, some definitions. Ecological validity is the degree to which results obtained in controlled conditions are related to those obtained in naturalistic environments. And this is frequently confused with external validity, which refers to how applicable a study's results are to populations and situations other than the ones studied, without specific regard for any correspondence or lack thereof between the laboratory and the real world. Traditionally, measuring ecological validity requires correlating data collected in the lab with data collected in the real world. For example, the ecological validity of tests of executive functioning, which measure things like working memory, attention, and inhibitory control, can be estimated by correlating participants' performance on them with their ability to perform everyday tasks. But fields like search and rescue HRI face serious obstacles to this strategy. One of them is impracticality. Between 2001 and 2014, ground robots were deployed in at least 23 different disasters worldwide, but no live dependents were ever encountered. And to my knowledge, the situation has not changed. A second challenge is clinical equipoise, the idea that researchers are only able to treat participants differently so long as no evidence exists of one treatment being superior to another. Once such evidence exists, you're harming some participants. And then there's the issue of informed consent. People in life-threatening or otherwise traumatic situations are by definition unable to consent to participate in research because they're under duress. Face validity is the extent to which a study or measure seems to get at what it claims to get at, regardless of whether it actually does. And our claim is that for researchers who are unable to estimate ecological validity by collecting data both in the lab and in the real world, face validity, measured in terms of presence, can be a useful proxy for ecological validity. It's important to talk about the scope of our argument. It's most relevant to fields that have things in common with search and rescue HRI, like the well-being of participants being at stake. So fields like military and police training, space exploration, and surgery all have that in common. It's less applicable to areas like assistive robotics and education, which can have negative consequences for participants, but those might be less chronic. But for any study, the onus is on researchers, ethics committees, and peer reviewers to determine whether any purported obstacles to real-world data collection are truly strong enough to justify reliance on this claim. So our contribution is threefold. First, we describe and clarify a complex theoretical problem that may be unfamiliar to you. To our knowledge, the only Chi paper or workshop to have touched on anything like this topic was one by Bennett and colleagues in 2006. The second contribution is the explication of relevant concepts and providing a glossary of key terms, and we do so with reference to the literatures on social psychology and virtual reality. And third, we provide a point of reference for discussion and perhaps resolution of certain validity issues. So there's a couple of ways to empirically justify the idea of face validity as a proxy for ecological validity. One is to predict ecological validity with face validity, and the only study that at first glance seems to attempt this is one by Denio and colleagues from 2015, but it didn't capture data from on-road driving, only driving simulators, so it's out. Another strategy is to correlate ecological and face validity, and Hayes' meta-analysis on the effectiveness of flight simulator training provides mixed evidence here. On the one hand, they found that the combination of real aircraft and simulator training led to better flight performance than real aircraft training alone, so that's consistent with our idea. But on the other hand, whether a simulator included motion cues had no effect on flight performance, which seems counterintuitive. So now we turn to some useful concepts in our theoretical justification of the claim. Transposition describes the maintenance of key structural conditions when moving from one situation to another, for example, in Milgram's study of obedience. For those unfamiliar, this study involved participants playing the role of a teacher and a confederate playing the role of a learner. The experimenter would instruct the teacher to deliver progressively intense electric shocks to the learner, and of interest were the points at which the teacher protested or refused to continue. Milgram transposed structural factors like hierarchical titles, teacher and learner, spatial separation by putting the teacher and learner in separate rooms, associated objects by attaching a net electroshock generator or giving that to the teacher and attaching electrodes to the learner, and ideological commitments. So the teacher was told that science is an end in itself, for example. Another concept is emergence. When a pattern or concept seems to emerge from a particular set of stimuli, then it is said to be an emergent property of those stimuli. So consider what happens when one is asked to determine whether democracy exists in a room full of congresspeople. One might observe the positions of the chairs, which are arranged such that people face one another instead of a single podium. One might listen to the way discussions are conducted, which seems fair and reasonable. Neither of these observations alone would determine the presence or absence of democracy, but the overall pattern that emerges might prompt one to declare that democracy can there be found. The more likely people are to make this same declaration, that is, the more democracy tends to emerge from the situation's details in the minds of different people, the more face valid the presence of democracy becomes. As this discussion suggests, there is a positive correlation between a simulation's realism and its face validity. However, there is a difference between the kind of realism that leads participants to take a simulation seriously and that which denotes a strong resemblance between the laboratory and the real world. The Handbook of Social Psychology calls these experimental and mundane realism, respectively. Experimental realism matters because people take real life seriously. If participants fail to take a simulation seriously, then it can hardly be claimed that the study's results apply to the real world. Mundane realism matters because similarity to the real world is often prerequisite to a situation being taken seriously. The two kinds of realism are far from independent. Throughout the 1970s, social psychologists, including Milgram, privileged experimental realism over mundane realism. And this raises an interesting question. Why create experiments that have no strong connection to the real world? And the reason is that experimental realism allows us to study psychological processes that matter a great deal, despite the fact that they are fictional or unlikely to happen in real life. For example, Jones and Sigal introduced what's known as the bogus pipeline technique, in which participants are hooked up to a lie detector, convinced that it works, and then questioned about their attitudes. The fact that lie detectors do not work and that few people would ever encounter one in real life did not prevent the researchers from discovering how people behave when they do not believe it is possible to lie. Experimental realism is beneficial to research areas like search and rescue HRI for the same reason. It is impossible to create a disaster scenario that has perfect mundane realism because to do so would cause harm to participants. Structural conditions that elicit sheer terror cannot be ethically transposed into the lab. The opposite is true of other structural conditions like sensory deprivation, uncertainty, and perceived dependence on a third party. These can introduce enough mundane realism that participants begin to suspend disbelief in the simulation, and if they do, then experimental realism has been achieved. The upshot is that even in the absence of any real danger, important conclusions can be drawn about how people think and behave when they are sensorially deprived and uncertain and feel dependent on outside help. In other words, one can draw conclusions that ought to apply wherever exist the structural conditions that were transposed. So now I want to talk about the field of virtual reality has developed measures that are useful for operationalizing realism. These are immersion and presence. Immersion, just like mundane realism, is a property of simulations. VR technologies that provide a wide field of vision, accurately and quickly track users in three-dimensional space, and offer stereoscopic vision are more immersive than ones that lack these features. Presence, just like experimental realism, is a property of user psychology. A user is said to be present in VR when they subjectively experience being inside the simulation as opposed to the real world. The more immersive the VR, the more present users tend to feel inside it. The same relationship holds for fields like search and rescue HRI, although the simulations are physical rather than virtual. Instead of field of vision, user tracking, and stereoscopic vision, physical simulations are made immersive through the use of props, trained actors, and deception, techniques borrowed from the art of stagecraft. The more immersive the physical simulation, the more present study participants tend to feel inside it. It's important to note that measures of presence get to the heart of what it means for a participant to take a simulation seriously. If a participant reports having experienced a virtual body as their own, that means that their avatar's actions and appearance have real consequences for their thoughts and feelings about themselves and others. If researchers observe someone use fewer paper towels after they've been educated through VR about deforestation, that means they took it seriously enough for it to affect their behavior. And if a participant sweats and experiences a rapid heartbeat while also claiming to have been present in a simulation, that ought to increase our belief in the idea that they took the simulation seriously. To sum up, measures of presence tell us about the experimental realism of a simulation, about how face-valid participants found it, and they are therefore how we ought to operationalize our proxies for ecological validity when real-world data cannot be collected. From 2011 to 2015, 3 studies were conducted with the goal of understanding how autonomous a robot should be in order to maximize positive outcomes for dependents. The variables used in each study were often different, but in each one, participants were instructed to imagine that an earthquake had just occurred and interacted with a robot for about 13 minutes while they awaited rescue. To measure presence, we paid attention to whether participants complied with basic instructions, such as not to touch the robot and how seriously they interacted with it. Responding sarcastically, for example, indicated lower presence. Here I'm calling this measure compliance. Details of the 3 studies can be found in their respective papers, but suffice it to say that the complexity of each simulation increased drastically across all 3 studies, as did compliance across studies 2 and 3. We went from a rudimentary physical simulation with a styrofoam enclosure to an elaborate simulation featuring a compelling script, realistic sound effects, and well-trained Confederates, and saw the number of participants showing these breaks in presence drop from around 50% to only 5%. We don't know whether the results of any of these studies will apply to real-world disaster scenarios, but the relatively high face validity of Study 3 makes us more confident in the ecological validity of its results than we are in the results of Study 2. I couldn't find images of the simulations from Studies 1 and 2, but this is what participants saw when taking cover under a table during Study 3. The image here is dimly lit, but participants experienced it in almost complete darkness, save for some intermittent flickering from the lamp that you see in the background. In the foreground, you can see the corners of rubble and binders that appear to have fallen from the walls and the bookshelf. The intensity of this simulation is not well captured in a single image. Before arriving in this room and taking cover, participants had been blindfolded and led on a meandering path to disorient them. They were also given a handheld radio that we had hacked to play a realistic radio announcement recorded with help from the campus radio station about the ostensible earthquake that had occurred. So in conclusion, here are 5 steps for you to take when creating immersive simulations. First, you should check to see whether you can collect real-world data. If you can, congratulations. You don't have to worry about most of this. Identify key structural conditions from the real-world situation of interest is the second step. For example, if you're running a lab on how people interact with a home robot, then hominess would be an important structural condition. Third, you want to transpose those structural conditions into the lab. In the same example, you could have each participant bring in a framed photo of a family member to set nearby while they go through the study. Fourth, you want to measure participants' presence. Nobody seems to do this currently unless they're studying VR, but it's the upshot of our entire argument. And fifth, you need to repeat this entire process. It's iterative, and you must constantly devise and test new strategies for improvement. Thanks. Yeah, happy to take questions.
So I have a question. So do you think about how the human emotional response could be simulated in this setup? Like post a disaster, they're probably going to be confused, disoriented, and
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when we were looking, are you talking about Study 3 in particular?
Yes.
Yeah. So we worked with researchers from Texas A&M University, Robin Murphy, CRAZAR, the Center for Robot Assisted Search and Rescue, who interact a lot with people who do this work on a day-to-day basis, and they told us a lot of different things that were helpful for setting up the study. They told us that the most important dependent variable to look after was how hopeful somebody was that they would be rescued soon. They told us the different challenges that people face when they're trapped, and we did everything we could to take those conditions they told us about and create laboratory versions of them. There's a couple of questions.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Tobi Grundgeiger from the University of Würzburg. I've been conducting lots of simulations in the medical domain with mannequins, like full-scale simulations in the medical domain where you interact in a physical world. And to me, it seems like you were talking about VR a lot. And in the medical domain, it's always important to look at what the actual aim is of that simulation and tailor this then to what you actually need to simulate. So if the aim is training, then you don't have to have all the touch and feel of the real world, but rather provide the tools so that the experts can kind of show their expertise in the training and then learn. And I was wondering what were the aims of your studies? Like, should they learn how to behave in those simulations or learn how to interact with technology in that interactions?
Yeah, it's a great question, thanks. So we were interested in the features that a search and rescue robot should have in order to make dependents, the people that are awaiting rescue, feel more hopeful that they're going to be rescued soon. And other things, like how much they trust the robot and the rescuers, that sort of thing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
More questions?
I have a bit of a philosophical question. While you can create more immersiveness by following the strategies you've mentioned, do you have any concerns related to ethics, like around deception? You can create more immersiveness if you deceive your participants well, but that may raise some other concerns for researchers.
Yeah, absolutely. Deception is a major issue, and it's one that we responded to by having thorough debriefs after every session, making sure that all of participants' concerns, whether immediately after they participated or weeks or months later, would be addressed. So we opened lines of communication and made sure we were always there. If somebody ever had a negative response during the study, which never happened, once there was a negative response prior to actually putting the blindfold on in study 3, but we would make those participants aware of campus resources for, talking about the experience or, how to get help.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's thank all our speakers.